Hey guys, welcome back to Tabletop Glory. My name is Graham Johnson, and today we're going to be talking about highlights, but I'm going to try and keep things relatively simple today, as highlights can be a pretty broad topic, and rather than overload you guys with a bunch of information that may or may not help you, we're going to be talking about the three things that help me the most, which are also the three questions that I get asked the most. Number one, where do I put my highlights? How far should I push those highlights in the contrast from the darkest point to its brightest point? And number three, should I be putting any kind of highlights in my shadows, and is it really worth the time to do so? So let's get on with the video. So the miniature that we're going to be using today that I'll be adding paint to as we talk about how we're going to apply our highlights is actually from the Wild West Exodus game. Now I actually got a chance to play this at PAX Unplugged right before lockdown, and if the store had still been open, this is a game I would definitely be pushing because it's actually a lot of fun, and I don't know why more people in my friend circle aren't talking about it, and I think people should be. If you're new to miniature painting, you've probably heard of a technique called Xenophil Highlighting, but what is it? Well, typically it's when you would spray paint or use an airbrush to paint the entire miniature black, and then maybe come in from above and paint some white or a gray. And this is going to give you a fairly okay understanding of where our brightest points are going to be, where all the ruffles in the fabric need to have their most extreme highlights. And you may want to take a photo after this so that you have a reference image. As we paint miniatures more and more, or if we're going to paint the whole miniature in a single sitting, we may not need to take a photo as a reference, and we may be able to remember. However, I tend to take this a step further when I do a lot of commission painting, or even when I'm doing something special for myself. And although I'll spray everything black, I will then come in with a gray or mid-tone color and spray everything around the midsection, leaving the black underneath. I don't recover up that black. And then I come in with either a brighter gray or an almost white and kind of hit everything from above. And then I come in with my airbrush and I'm going to decide where my light source is coming from, whether that be the sun, a lantern, whatever the case may be for that light source, and that is where I'm going to spray my pure white. So if I want the light source to be a rising or setting sun in front of the miniature, I might go ahead and do a very light coat of about a 15 to 30 degree angle of white around the front of the miniature, leaving that gray behind. That is going to help me to decide where my highlights are, even in the shadows, because they won't be as bright as my brightest white highlight that I've applied to the face. And that's what I've done with this miniature here. Now, it's important to keep in mind that there may be more than one thing that you want to draw attention to, whether it be the face of the miniature, the weapon, or a sigil of some kind, perhaps a magical item, whether it itself is giving off light, or perhaps maybe a nearby campfire or lantern is giving off a light source. So if your character, perhaps you want to tell the story that it is at sunset and they are leading away from the light source, so their back would be where the brightest highlights are, but they're holding a lantern, so you're going to spray a little bit of extra white in and around the lantern area and their face to illuminate it. And then that's going to help you to keep track of my brightest highlights are both to their back and where the light source is going to be showing. Now this is a really great way to kind of keep track of everything when it comes to all the stories that we want to tell with our painting. Now if you're anything like me, probably what's going through your head right now is, whoa man, that was a lot of information. And you're right, so let's break it down and kind of make things about as simple as we can. And if you're not really concerned about realism and where light falls, a really good way to do this would simply be to paint your miniature black and then use white or gray to do a dry brush over the whole thing. If at the end of the day, just breaking down the miniature into its basic shapes where the ruffles on a dress are simply a tube and you know that the outermost section of that tube needs to have the brightest highlights, then there's nothing wrong with that. At the end of the day, it's all about powering through our collection and painting as many minis as we can and being happy with the result. So if something works well for you, then I'm really happy that you found it and I'm glad it works well for you. So back when I owned my game store, I would teach an in-person painting class. And one of the things that I would try to push home when someone wasn't really sure what colors they wanted to use on their miniature was to pick 3 colors within the range. And what I mean by that is, if you know you want the cape to be red, you should pick a dark red, somewhere in the middle of an orange color, and maybe at the brightest end a yellow. And by mixing those 3 colors together, you should be able to create the entire spectrum of color that you want to use to paint that cloak red, where your most extreme highlights maybe will be pure yellow, but in reality are probably going to be an extremely bright orange. But because you have used those 3 colors and you've created kind of a color pyramid that you can mix and match to get all the different variants that you want, you're going to be able to create this really smooth, creamy blend from the darkest dark to the brightest bright. And there are some things that you can use to cheat your way through and kind of skip some steps and blend different colors together better. But when you're first getting started and you're still learning blending and trying to get everything to look nice, trying to skip steps can sometimes trip you up when you're still kind of teaching yourself the foundation. So if you're still new to miniature painting and you're not really sure how to feather colors together or blend colors together or wet blend or anything like that, it may be more beneficial for you to just do like 6 or 7 layers and just go up a step every time and cover less and less of the miniature, but use a brighter and brighter color as you go. We interrupt the middle of this video to talk to you about Patreon. Now, many of you guys know that I have had a Patreon for a while, but I don't think many of you have actually gone and clicked on that link. You'll see with the image on screen right now that I actually have a minimum $2 subscription, and that is pretty small compared to a lot of the other people on Patreon. I actually don't need a ton of money to be able to do this full time, and any support that you guys can give me would be spectacular. Now, if you're more or less interested in a singular donation and you don't want to do a monthly subscription service, I totally understand that. If you go down into the description of this video, there's going to be a link to my Linktree, which will have links out to things like Venmo and PayPal, or even an Amazon wishlist if you want to buy a tool or some kind of neat model for me to paint on YouTube. In any case, it would mean the world to me if you guys would consider going and checking that out and maybe even subscribing, as I'd love to be a full-time content creator and I can't do that without your support. In any case, thank you guys so much for watching. Please hit the like, maybe even consider sharing the video, and in any case, let's get back to painting. So to elaborate on what we've just talked about, I'm going to go ahead and paint the jacket on this character. Now, I'm going to be using nothing but XV88, which is a nice leather brown color. That's going to be my mid-tone. The original color that I've laid down here is a contrast paint, but something similar to it. You could start out with like a dryad bark and build up your color from there, which dryad bark is very dark and would make some beautiful shadows. And then I'm going to be going all the way up through Xandri Dust. One of the best parts about starting with the darkest color first is that as you build up highlights, you can paint a little bit in the shadows, and you kind of tend to get that natural blend between your brightest brights and your darkest darks. Now, although it is true that the areas that are most exposed to sunlight or your source of light should be the brightest, these first few layers you can just kind of cover up a general shape and leave that darkest color in the farthest recess. In the case of this first layer that I'm adding right now, I'm simply marking out the basic shape of that ruffle in the fabric. Now this is where his hip is, and then it's also flowing out into the weights at the bottom of the cape. So picking up the pace here, I'm going to just speed up the video a little bit. You can see here I've done some XV88 and I've mixed a little bit of Xandri Dust into it to get a nice brighter color. Now you can see I'm only focusing on those raised edges where sunlight would be exposed to it. I'm not going back in and putting anything in the shadowed areas. This is just the first layer of what most people see when you do a Xenophil highlight. These are these first layers of gray and a little bit of the white section. And we'll continue to build these up by adding brighter and brighter colors until we do our basic weathering stage, which is almost pure Xandri Dust on its own. Finishing off, we're basically mixing 50-50 XV88 and Xandri Dust. There are a few places where I go extreme pure Xandri Dust, and that's mostly in the weathering stages and adding little scratches and things like that. I find it important to do this because it kind of brings everything together. By using my extreme highlight color as a way to start the weathering, it helps blend everything together and make it feel more grounded in reality. Now, in my opinion, there are two things that really set a paint scheme apart. And number one is contrast between your brightest brights and your darkest darks. We've talked about that frequently throughout that. And that's because I feel like this has been one of the more important ones. Even I myself sometimes find myself struggling to push my contrast to the point where it needs to be. One of the tips that I give you is to always kind of put your highlights a step above where you actually think they need to be, and you'll probably be a little bit on the safe side. But also don't worry about it, because you can always come back in and modify it later if you're not happy with it. Number two is layers. Layers are just a wonderful way to really set your miniature apart and gives it a lot of depth and age, especially like with a leather jacket, by building up all of your highlights and then washing it all back down with a brown, and then building the highlights up slightly differently, washing it back down with a brown, building them up differently again. You can create this just a beautiful array of varying depths from your darkest dark to your brightest bright, even if you were using the exact same colors every single time you created a new layer. And it's thanks to that wash that really allows that to happen. And you can do this with all kinds of things, from skin tone to the membrane on like a dragon wing, or pretty much anything else that you want to give a weathered appearance to. It's a really versatile tool. Now, this is after just a little while of me playing around with things and kind of taking it to this middle tone of it's well loved and well worn, but well maintained, and so the weathering's not super over the top, but there are some places where that Xandri dust can really pop. Now, as many of you probably figured out long by now, is that I am not putting any of the paint names on screen. I always try to make that an effort to make sure that's in a video these days, and I did a departure from that because this isn't really a tutorial. This is more or less me talking about various processes that are going on when I'm thinking about where my highlights need to end up, so that's why we didn't do that. So this last one's actually going to go pretty quickly, as there's not really any tangible thing that I could show you other than encouraging you to go out onto social media. I personally like things like Pinterest, and just look at what other painters are doing. When it comes to putting color in your shadows, I'm not a big fan of just leaving it a black void, but there are plenty of people that do so. And arguably, it's also a really great way to kind of get yourself army ready, or get yourself tabletop ready. It's less stuff for you to paint, and on the flip side, if it's something like in the nook of an armor inside the armpit, is anybody really going to notice if it's just a general play piece? Probably not. But if you're painting a bust or a competition piece, you're probably going to want to put some kind of color in the shadows. And there are some artists that what they'll simply do is either use a blue or a purple or something like that that is their favorite shadow color, or they'll even take it all the way into color theory and look at what their shadow color should be based on that and a color wheel, and they'll just kind of lay that all in. For me, I kind of have to eyeball things because of my color blindness, and so sometimes you'll see me do a lot of experimentation where I might start with purples, but I end with greens as my shadow color. And what I mean by shadow color is just a color that I mix into the other colors I'm already using to create all of my shadows. So a really good example of this would be as if you had a character with a red tabard, you might want to add in purple or blue into that red to darken it up for the shadows. And some people would take it a step farther and use the exact same highlight colors that they would use on the front of the tabard, and then mix that shadow color into those highlights and use it on the back of the tabard to highlight everything that's in shadow. And there's nothing wrong with that, and in a lot of cases even I myself use that, but there are some color theory stuff that we're not going to go into today that can sometimes tell us that that's actually wrong to do it that way. And it all has to do with the way that light plays off the environment, which as someone who is painting miniatures, we don't really typically care about that stuff, again, unless we're doing something like a competition piece. So, in any case, I hope you guys have learned something, And I'm sorry if some things have felt kind of cryptic. I'm trying to make this as simple as possible, and sometimes things might get a little lost along the way. So if you do have any questions about this and you would like me to go more in detail, please leave comments below on anything that might confuse you, or even subjects that I didn't cover in today's video that you would like me to cover in the future. And I'll be more than happy to make some videos about that to elaborate more on it and help get you guys painting faster. In any case, my name has been Graham Johnson. This is Tabletop Glory. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for all the love and support. And as always, may your display case always be filled and your pile of shame never run empty. Until next time.